Hi everyone. I've decided to make a video discussion around a scenario and a resource and the thinking that would underpin the writing of a rationale to meet the requirements of Assessment 2. So there's already in the Assessment 2 resources, there is a formal academic example of a rationale. But what I'm doing here is something more informal. If I was in a classroom with you, I would be able to we could talk this through, a little bit like we did in the Live Collaborate, but we didn't get down to sort of the nitty-gritty of following something through that addressed all the requirements in the folio. So I'm going to tell you a story or tell you a scenario that's not a scenario from the assessment, but you may see some similarities between this one and the Margot scenario. But keep in mind that this is a 4-year-old child, so Margot's only 2. So, the ideas that I have here aren't just completely transferable to the Margot scenario. What I want to do is talk through really the theory practice connections here and the notion of policy and principles and practices and the theories that underpin those and how it all relates to the resource. How you then, if you were working through your assignment in this way and noting down key points and getting your theories aligned and your readings, then you would have to pull it together into a proper 500-word rationale with supporting references. And that's your job as a student to create that rationale. I'm just going to illustrate verbally some ideas for how you might do that. So the scenario is a real life scenario. It's my 4-year-old son was in sessional kindergarten. He was doing 3 to 4 hour sessions at kindergarten, spending lunchtime there and then being picked up very soon after for 3 days a week. And then when I returned to full-time work, he was suddenly in long daycare as well. So 3 days at kindergarten and 2 days in long daycare. And he was having a lot of difficulty settling into long daycare because I think there was quite a bit of difference. The day was much longer and he was expecting me to pick him up just after lunch like I had been doing in kindergarten. And when that didn't happen, the educator reported that he was very anxious. Every afternoon he was wanting to know when Mummy was coming to pick him up and what was the time and when would she be there. And the educator was concerned that his anxiety was preventing him from, engaging with other children, the curriculum, all the experiences that were offered, because he was too busy worrying about when I was going to turn up to pick him up. So I guess that's the behaviours. And her concerns were sort of coming from this notion that, she was concerned about his well-being and how that was impacting on his ability to learn and his ability to socialise. So what she did was she made him a day chart, a little bit like sort of that example from Margot, a day chart that had pictures of the routines of the day, all the things that happened during the day, particularly the late afternoon routines, the snack, the outdoor playtime. When I would normally come to pick him up, then there was a photo of me to indicate that this is when he could expect me to arrive. So he used to check the chart during the day and say things like after lunch, after a sleep, after snack, at outdoor time, Mummy comes to pick me up. And he would be pointing to the chart and the pictures as he went along. So this resource was developed by the educator to address and support an individual child to prevent particular behaviour. So that's that preventative approach, because the aim is to prevent the anxious behaviour. It's not to try and distract the child and keep him busy and not acknowledge it. It's to actually, it acknowledges his anxiety but then works to help him not be anxious, to be more in control of his emotions. So I would see this immediately as reflecting humanist theory, that the teacher was working on that sort of humanist theory, with the aim being to ensure the child's need to feel safe and secure. But there's other theories, I think, that could be used to justify this resource if I was taking this and turning it into an assessment item. So I'm going to talk those through to you now, but just based on this scenario, if I was using this scenario and this resource for my assessment, this is how I would justify it. These are the theories that I'd use. So this would be a resource for an individual around relationships with the self, because the resource is that pictorial daily schedule for a 4-year-old. And now these are the key points in the rationale that I would be covering as required by the assessment details. So identifying the behaviours. The behaviour is, asking when the mother's going to be picking him up, and it's really about anxiety, a sense of anxiety, a lack of engagement in the afternoon program because of the continual looking for the mother to come and pick him up. So the resource, this pictorial daily schedule, the way that I would, and that this particular teacher developed it and introduced it, was to involve the child and the parent. So I was involved in taking photos of myself and my son getting ready for daycare and getting in the car and coming and dropping him off. Then he was involved with the teacher in taking photos of the activities and putting the daily schedule together, and then there was a photo of me coming to pick him up at the end of the day. So that's the way that it would be introduced. And it reflects a preventive approach, and it also is about creating a safe, supportive and productive learning environment with the child. If he's not anxious anymore, he's going to be able to be productive in his learning. He's going to feel safe, he's going to feel supported, and that's preventing the behaviour. So some of the key points, the things that I would be talking about in my rationale, I would want to point out that this information is in a format that suits the child's developmental level. We're not talking about clock time here. We're not putting up a clock and telling him at 5 o'clock mummy will come. The child can understand and predict when his mother will arrive to collect him of an afternoon. So, it's reflecting sort of cognitive theory, the resource there. It's suited to the child's developmental level. He can make sense of the daily schedule. The resource acknowledges the child's feelings. There's care and support from the teacher to meet the child's needs. This fits with humanism, that safety, that love, belonging. It again reflects the safe, supportive learning environment. So that's a very humanistic approach. It's drawing on humanism. It's reflecting humanism. Whether that's consciously done or not, we can see the theory in the resource and how it's being introduced. The fact that the schedule's developed with the child and the parent again reflects the socio-cultural theory, that social nature of learning. There's social interaction here, which that has an effect on the development of cognition, according to Vygotsky. Child can't do this on their own. This is about helping him work in his zone of proximal development, helping him be able to understand something that he couldn't perhaps understand without this support. And it also reflects ecological theory, because you've got the parent involved and we're linking the microsystems, the home, leaving the home and coming to daycare, and the daycare environment as a microsystem. So that's the mesosystem, the connection between those two. So you could make a good argument or present a justification in your rationale that this is definitely preventative, it's about a safe, supportive and productive learning environment using these points. And you would I haven't put theories in here, but I've just noted down the bottom that you would need to cite, I've introduced theories, but I haven't cited my sources because I'm just talking about it here. But if I was writing this into a formal rationale for the assignment, of course, all my points, my discussions, my claims would be supported by referring to references, academic sources. So you can see there I think the theory, the notion of the resource and how it's introduced. The theories jump out at you. You can make your rationale based around that. I'm going to look in the next slide at policies, practices, principles that you could integrate into your discussion. So, for example, developing the schedule with the child and with the parent would reflect some of the principles in the early years learning framework, and I would use the early years learning framework for Australia because this child is 4 and it's an early childhood setting. You could also use the Victorian early years learning and development framework, which actually covers up to 8. So keep those ones in mind. I wouldn't be using the Australian curriculum to help support my justification for this resource because that's for schools. So when we're mentioning humanism there and belonging, the early years learning framework, one of its principles is around belonging and children belonging in the educational environment. So I'll just focus on those now. But you wouldn't necessarily have a separate section for this. You would integrate your discussion. The assessment talks about the policies, the principles and practices that are reflected in your resource and the theories that underpin those policies, principles and practices. And then, of course, they relate to your resource. So you're weaving it together. It's integrated as a sort of a holistic explanation or justification for the resource. Theories, policy, principles and practices. So if I'm thinking about the resource that I've just developed and how I've developed it and how I've implemented it or introduced it, immediately knowing the early years learning framework, I can see some principles and practices that are reflected in that resource. And the early years learning framework document is the policy, and it has, if you haven't read it before, I'd suggest having a read of it because it talks about the principles that underpin the approach of the early years learning framework and then the practices which arise out of those principles or that reflect those principles. And it also talks about the theoretical frameworks that underpin the whole document. So I think it would be very useful for those scenarios that involve younger children. So the principles that immediately spring to mind when I think about my resource are secure, respectful and reciprocal relationships and partnerships. So you can have a look on page 12. The early years learning framework talks about the need to develop secure, respectful and reciprocal relationships, and this resource reflects that because of the way it's developed together with the parent, the child and the teacher to develop those relationships. Partnerships, talking about children developing partnerships with families because children are learning, learning as a partnership. And again, the way that resource has been developed reflects that principle, a partnership with the family in the developing of the resource. So, and those two principles reflect or are underpinned by socio-cultural theory, ecological and humanist theoretical perspectives. Secure, safe, relationships, partnerships, that's socio-cultural, ecological. I could also link it to Learning Outcome 1, a strong sense of identity, because the resource helps the child, I'm quoting here, to feel safe, secure and supported. It develops his emerging autonomy, resilience and sense of agency. And humanist theory underpins that outcome, and I think you should be able to see that very clearly. There's keywords, safety, supported, autonomy, resilience, self-esteem, all that humanist stuff. And if I go further into the document and look at practices, they talk about holistic approaches, again, which is humanism. You've got to take into account the whole child, not just the cognitive aspects and their learning, but also their well-being and their emotions. The practice of responsiveness, again, that's humanism, but also socio-cultural theory. If we're being responsive and we're working together with the child, with the family, it reflects socio-cultural theory. And the practice of continuity and successful transitions is very much underpinned by ecological systems theory. That notion of wanting the child to have some continuity coming from a short session or kindergarten into a longer day, and the resource helps him to understand the differences, helps him to understand when his mother's going to come, and it's also about helping with a successful transition. So I hope that gives you some sort of a sense that it's not sort of in order. You know, we want to craft that into a rationale that explains and justifies the resource, but they're all the bits that I'd draw on if I was writing this assignment, and clearly referencing my sources. Any questions? Get on the Assessment 2 Q&A and ask for further clarification if you need it. Bye for now.